Hey everybody. So in this video I'm going to go over the PowerPoint on Introduction to Drama, which covers chapters 28 through 30. Okay. Chapter 28 is really more of just, an intro to drama. How do I read a play? Right? So we're going to look at, because normally you watch a play, right? So we're going to look at some tips for how to make sure you read the play in the best way possible. So, first thing on slide 3 is listen to the lines. Okay? You're going to be reading it. You're not necessarily going to have an audio of it. You have to read the lines. But remember, a play is spoken. So you have to imagine. You can either read it out loud, or maybe get someone to help you and take turns with the parts. But if you're reading it on your own, and you don't want to read it out loud, then you have to hear it in your head. Not just read the words, but imagine hearing them. Because it is dialogue. It's all spoken. And so you have to, you have to imagine what the tone would be based on the context of the scene. Would it be sarcastic? Would it be sad? Would it be angry? Right? How would those lines be delivered? How should you hear them in your head? But keeping in mind that they are supposed to be spoken, read them as such. Right? The next tip is to visualize the scene. Imagine what the stage would look like, right? So in a traditional theater, right, you've got the audience sitting in front of the stage, and the stage is kind of raised. We have what's called the proscenium, which is the arch from which the curtains hang, right, because the curtains will open when a scene begins and close when a scene ends, or at least when an act ends, right? So that arch where the curtains hang from, that's the proscenium. Then there's the apron. So if the curtains are down, the apron is the part that's from the curtain to the edge where the footlights are, right? You also want to keep in mind stage directions, because they're often in italics in a play when you're reading it. It's what the playwright included, like if they wanted to make sure that a certain character was positioned in a certain part of the stage, or a certain set piece was in a certain part of the stage, or that the lighting was a certain way. They will include those directions, and they'll be typically, a lot of times in parentheses, but also in italics before a character starts speaking. Those are stage directions, right? And you might want to know that if a stage direction indicates that something is supposed to happen upstage is farther away from the audience, towards the back of the stage. Downstage is down towards the front, closer to the audience, the front part of the stage. Okay? If it mentions anything about set pieces, if the word flat is mentioned, a flat is like a canvas covered frame that helps create the illusion of a room. They're like walls, right? But sets can be very elaborate or very minimal. Sometimes, though, I think keeping all that in mind about stage directions especially, some playwrights don't really include any stage directions. It's just the characters and the dialogue. Other playwrights include a lot of very specific stage directions. And how it affects our reading of the play, it all depends. How it affects the performance of a play, that can have a big impact. Especially, because then you have a playwright who wrote this play, envisioned it being performed in a certain way. Years later, a director decides to put on a performance of this play. And that director has some creative, freedom, and they might choose to follow the stage directions exactly, or maybe they don't, right? So what you're reading is the playwright's vision, not a director. So it's what the playwright imagined as he or she was writing the play. But try to envision what it would look like on the stage. Try to visualize the scene. Envision the action, right? So obviously drama relies heavily on spoken word, but there are other visual elements to it as well. The movement and gestures of the characters, the set pieces, if there are any. It might be included in the playwright stage directions, but maybe not. But you can imagine it on your own as well. So you have to use your own imagination when you read a play. And critical thinking skills, because you have to think about the plot, the action of a scene, the character themselves, and how lines would be spoken, how they would be delivered, what kind of movements and gestures make sense in the scene, right? So it's not going to be as helpful if you just read the lines. It might that you might not necessarily truly understand the plot or the character or the theme of the play. You have to use your imagination and those critical thinking skills together to really get the full experience without getting the full experience. Slides 6 and 7 offer some critical questions to ask while you're reading a play. Things like, what is the central conflict? Are there any secondary conflicts, like subplots? And if so, how do they relate to the main conflict? Oftentimes, if there's a subplot or like a secondary storyline, it is directly connected to the main storyline. And it might be a similar situation to help us fully understand the bigger conflict better, or it might be something completely opposite. But typically, if there is a subplot, it is supposed to show us something, or it's supposed to teach us something about the main storyline. Does it follow traditional dramatic structure, which we will learn about? So think about that. Does it follow that format? Who is the main character or the protagonist? What sort of person is he or she? Does this protagonist, does the main character have any kind of fatal flaw? Is the protagonist a hero in any way? What about the antagonist? And that's kind of like, we typically would say like the villain or the bad guy, but it's just whoever is in opposition to the main character. Is it a person? Is it the environment? Is it a social force? If it's a person, is the conflict intentional, or is it accidental? Do any of the other characters give us any kind of background information, what we would call exposition? Are they sharing information with us that happened before the play began, before the timeline of the play? Are they sharing information with us so that we get a better understanding of what's currently happening in the play? Are they foils? Some characters are what we call foils, and they are sort of, they might be a contrast to the main character or one of the main characters. And we're supposed to recognize that conflict, and that foil, that other secondary character, will help us learn more about the main character. What's the setting, both historically and locally, geographically? Are these elements important? Is the setting important? Could the play just as effectively be set in another time or place and work? Or does the setting have a direct impact on the play? What about the title? Does the title provide any kind of clues about the theme or what we're supposed to think about the play? What is the theme? We'll learn about theme. Can you state it in a single sentence? The theme is like the underlying message that the play is supposed to give us. Is it a tragedy? Is it a comedy? Is it a mixture? All of these questions, you don't have to, go through them one at a time and answer them methodically. They're just ideas and questions to keep in the back of your mind as you're reading the play. Questions to ask yourself to make sure that you are fully understanding the play itself as well as the overall impact of the play. Okay. Chapter 29 talks more about dramatic structure. All right. So we're going to look at the plot, right? It's the most important element of drama, the plot, the story. It typically has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Especially in a play. That playwright has to get our attention and engage us right away. But then keep our attention, right? That's good drama. So, the heart of any good dramatic story is the argument, the conflict, right? It's what creates tension and piques our interest, right? Sometimes it can be a really, really big conflict, Sometimes it's smaller, but it still presents obstacles for the characters. And there's usually two sides of that conflict represented on stage, sort of the pro and the con. So we have the antagonist, or the protagonist. The protagonist is our main character, the one that we relate to the most, the one that most readers and audience members root for. That's the protagonist. And then we have the antagonist. The antagonist, we might call them the villain, but honestly, sometimes the antagonist isn't even a person. If you think about the main character, the person we're supposed to be rooting for, if they experience some sort of conflict in the story, that conflict might not even come from another person. It could be internal, it could be environmental, it could be society in general that's creating the conflict. So just keep in mind that our antagonist might not even be an actual person. Depending on what you're looking at, though, what kind of drama, and especially when it was written, most of the time the antagonist will at least be embodied in human form in some way. Maybe this person represents the societal pressure. But just that's protagonist and antagonist, right? The story and the characters are often revealed to us with a very specific pattern of dramatic structure. And the first stage is what we call point of attack. This is the starting point from which the playwright leads us into the plot. And if you think about the story that's being told, the point of attack, where the play begins, might be at the beginning of that story. That way, we're kind of discovering everything at the same time the characters do. But just like with any type of fictional creation, whether it's a play, a short story, a novel, a movie, sometimes we don't start at the beginning. Sometimes the author or the playwright starts us off right in the middle, or maybe right at the end. And then we go back and learn what happened. Most of the time, though, a play is going to have that sort of classic structure, beginning, middle, end. But just keep in mind, for anything you read, there's no rule that says you have to start at the beginning. You could, artists are free to experiment and do different things. But the point of attack is where the playwright starts us off in the story. Might be the beginning, might not be. But the point of attack is basically where we are when the story begins. The next step in dramatic structure is exposition. So this is where we sort of get the background information. In a play, it's probably going to come from what the characters are saying. They might start they might have a conversation, and, the two characters, the group of characters, are going to discuss something about the past. And we need that information in order to fully understand the present in the story. But we don't get paragraphs because this is a play. So that has to be done through the characters, right? The next step is what we call the rising action. So this is when things are going to start building within that conflict. The conflict will be introduced if it hasn't already, and this is where our interest starts to get more piqued. This is where things will start to get more tense, where we will start to wonder, ooh, what's going to happen, right? Typically during this stage, the protagonist and the antagonist are moving steadily towards some type of confrontation. Like, we know all of this is leading to something bigger. Something's going to happen, right? The thing that happens is our next step, which is the climax. This is the play's high point. It's the showdown. It's the turning point of the story. This is what it's all been building towards, and we know it. And once it's reached, that's like the point of no return. Now the confrontation has to happen, right? Whether it ends in a good way or a bad way for our main character, we don't know yet. But something is happening, and there's nothing we can do to stop it now, right? That's the climax. The fifth stage is what we call the falling action. So this is right after the climax. The plot starts to unravel. Events are starting to fall into place. It's where we can feel the story moving towards a final resolution. But it's not the end yet. The end comes in our sixth step, and it's called the denouement. It's a French word. It literally means untying. This is the play's conclusion. It's the explanation or the outcome of the action. This is where, the lovers kiss or marry. The bodies are carried off the stage, right? What, comedy, tragedy, whatever. So don't confuse the falling action with the denouement. If I could explain it in a more accessible way, I would maybe try to relate it to a movie. So if we're dealing with like an action-adventure movie, and the whole thing has been building up to that climax, that battle, that showdown, that fight, whatever. And then, over here is the ending, where we see that there's a happily ever after, or whatever, or not. Maybe it's just utter catastrophe. And we see that here. This is where the director, the screenwriter, they let us know what's in store for the main characters after the movie is over. But there's that space in between. There's that space in between the climax and that final scene where we get our resolution, where everything's, the word denouement is untying, but I almost think of it as tying up, wrapping it up in a bow. I think of it almost in the opposite way. But there's that middle section there where the battle's over, but we're not quite good yet, right? That's the falling action, is where, we're kind of in the aftermath of the climax. There's still stuff to clean up. There's still apologies to be made, or confessions to be made. I'm thinking more confessions of love, but it could be confessions of wrongdoing, where everything falls together. That's the falling action. And then the denouement is that very end scene where we see everybody happily ever after or going their separate ways or whatever the case may be. And then the audience goes home. Okay? Those are our 6 stages of dramatic structure. Most drama, most stories in general for that matter, will follow that formula. Right? Chapter 29, I'm sorry, that was chapter 29. Chapter 30 talks more about character, right? Because all we get are the characters in drama. We rely on the characters for so much of the story. Not like reading a short story or reading a novel or even watching a movie where, you know, we can get close-ups of what characters are doing. All we have in drama are what they say and a little bit of what they do, right? So we're going to look at, real quick, the classical tragic hero and the modern tragic hero. So the classical tragic hero comes from Aristotle, way back in ancient Greece, right? The classic tragic hero was someone who was highly renowned and prosperous. So that's why when you go back and read really old drama, like Antigone and, you know, anything by Sophocles, anything coming up to the modern period, oftentimes the main character of a play is either a real life person that existed in history or a fictional version, but they're always like royalty or nobility or someone in very high standing in their community. It's always someone who is a big deal, right? The classic tragedy is the inevitable destruction of that person. And it's usually because of a character flaw that that person possesses. It doesn't necessarily make them a bad person or a villain, because they're not the villain, they're the protagonist. But it's usually a disproportionate measure of a specific human attribute. Like, it turns out they were too prideful, or they were too jealous, or they were too indecisive. Some sort of character flaw that they possess a little too much of. And it's that flaw that becomes their undoing. There was this, and I think it still exists, honestly, but this idea that it was all about moderation. You know, you didn't want to exist in life with absolutely no pride. That's not going to be good for you. But you clearly don't want to exist in life with too much pride. So it was this message of proportion. And if that proportion is off, if it's violated, tragedy and calamity will ensue. So that was the classic tragic hero. But mid-1900s, a very interesting playwright by the name of Arthur Miller. And you might not recognize that name, but you might recognize his most famous work, which was Death of a Salesman, Willy Loman. And Arthur Miller introduced us to the modern tragic hero. And I won't say that he turned the idea of the classic tragic hero on its head. He just looked at it a little differently. And instead of that hero, that main character, being someone who was highly renowned and famous and prosperous or just highly respected, Miller's hero was just your average guy, right? And he, in fact, he was often the opposite of highly renowned or highly respected. A lot of times, he was sort of, people would make fun of him behind his back. Miller's, classic modern hero. But Miller wanted to emphasize the clash between the main character and the environment, especially the social environment. So the hero no longer has to be noble or highly respected, but instead his hero sort of gains stature, sort of gains people's respect by pitting himself against the cosmos, against fate, against society. So Arthur Miller's modern hero is more about the conflict between our ideal self-image and reality. Because, someone like Willy Loman, who thinks that he is, he's doing good. He thinks he's a great salesman. He thinks, his children respect him. He thinks his wife respects him. He thinks his, colleagues and people, that he interacts with. And honestly, they kind of don't respect him. They kind of make fun of him. He's kind of the butt of some jokes. And it's really kind of tragic to see what happens to Willy. But it's because he is having that internal conflict between how he viewed himself and the reality. And that sort of became a very common take on our protagonists and heroes of drama post Death of a Salesman and Arthur Miller. Okay? So you're going to read a play, and it's not terribly long. I didn't want this to be a huge undertaking and read like a 4-act play, or read like, in the textbook there's Othello by Shakespeare, which, don't get me wrong, I would love to work with you guys on Othello. But, given the constraints of the course, it being online, not being, not getting to do this in person, and knowing that you guys are having to do all of this on your own at home, I picked one that first was from an American playwright, because this is American literature, and as much as I would love to teach Shakespeare to you guys, Shakespeare is not American. So I picked one by an American author, Susan Glaspell, and the play is called Trifles, and it's a 1-act play, so it's very short. And I want you to think about what we've gone over here in this PowerPoint. Again, remembering all the tips to reading drama, listening to the lines, envisioning the scene, envisioning the action. Right? I want you to think about those 6 stages of dramatic structure, and think about how Trifles does or does not follow that pattern. It's going to seem like a really anticlimactic play, because we have that dramatic structure where the rising action takes us to that climax, and it's the big showdown. It's what we've been waiting for. And you're not going to get that in Trifles. It's going to be much more subdued. But I want you to see if you can still recognize the stages of dramatic structure in the play. And then I want you to think about this idea of either the classic tragic hero or the modern tragic hero. And if we get any kind of hero in Trifles, and again, I can tell you this, if there is a hero in the play, it will not be what you typically imagine as a hero. And I'm not saying it does or doesn't fall under either category. I'm just saying, it is a very subdued play. It's going to seem like nothing happens, but something does happen. So, just keep all this in mind while you read it. I will also provide a link to a YouTube video of a community theater putting on a performance of Trifles. And to give you an idea of how short the play is, the video is less than 25 minutes long. So to put on this play from start to finish takes less than a half an hour. It's not going to seem like a very exciting story but I hope that you guys, knowing that ahead of time, will help you get into the story a little easier and not feel let down because it's not this big fantastical showdown, or what have you. That it's really much more real life. It's actually one of the most realistic plays you could probably ever watch. Because it truly mimics, and it's actually based on a true story. So keep that in mind too. Alright, so that's it for our introduction to drama. If you have any questions about the material, feel free to reach out to me. But, know that this material is here to help you understand trifles better, as well as, do well on the drama and poetry exam that you'll take in week 4. A lot of the information from these slides will show up on that exam. So at some point, make sure you're going through this, very carefully and letting me know if you have any questions about it. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on.